Hello!
Hello. Lesson 2 on 3 conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. These are cities, they are places in the world where the leaders of the big 3 countries, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain will meet to decide the fate of the world at as World War II approaches its conclusion. And as we left off last lesson, we know that those 3 countries were in an uneasy alliance. They were combined together to fight the military might of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And by 1943, the situation had clearly turned. Now, it was obvious at this point that Germany will lose the war.
And this is incredibly important because as soon as you know your rival is going to lose the war, you need to start deciding what's going to happen next. And this is a problem because the Allies want different things. Although they are working together, because they have such different views of the world and such different objectives and interests, they are going to inevitably disagree about what's going to happen next. Now, we are going to look at a series of conferences, the 3 conferences already mentioned, where they try and work out what's going to happen next. It's very important to note that in 1943 we have the Tehran Conference, the first one, and they get the most agreed out of anything. In the second conference they get less agreed, and the last conference they get basically nothing agreed. The reason for this is such. In 1943 they are winning the war. Germany is being pushed back on the Eastern Front, being pushed back in the Mediterranean, and it's quite clear that they are losing. But the Allies still need to work together, still need to fight Germany, and there's a lot of hard fighting. As people need to work together, they're more willing to compromise. To come to the next 2, and they're in 1945. One just before the war ends in Europe, one just after. And at this point, both parties are now more content that actually they don't need to work together as much anymore, and they're got a bigger eye on making sure that they don't compromise too much. And as we shall see, there's far more disagreement. So,
that disagreement becomes pretty obvious when you look at what each country wanted. Great Britain wanted to retain the old system. It wanted to be the head of a large empire. It wanted to trade with its colonies and give no one else access to the economies of those countries. So this is known as a closed imperial economic system, one where the British government in London dominates the world through trade with its own colonies. The United States wasn't so much for that. They sort of thought that the old dog's day was done, and they wanted to retain huge spheres of influence in all of the Western Hemisphere, to be the top dog in world politics in North America and Central America, South America, and very acutely in the Pacific, where the United States had and controlled countries that we know of today, like the Philippines, which are very much large islands in Asia, as one example. And they wanted a worldwide free market, very much opposed to the closed markets that Britain wanted. But they wanted the sort of system of worldwide trade where they could, of course, with their giant economy, dominate. The USSR, the Soviet Union, on the other hand, they wanted domination of Eastern Europe. They were pushing the Nazis back from the borders of Russia all the way through the countries of Eastern Europe, such as Romania and Poland, into Germany, and they wanted to keep the domination that they had over those countries. They wanted to instill a communist Marxist system and to promote their the interests of world communism worldwide.
I think it's really important to realize as well, Great Britain and USA versus the USSR, they are both eyeing up. They know each other, the USA and Great Britain versus the USSR, are going to be each other's enemies in the future. They don't want to give too much power, too much land, too much influence away without any compromise. And therefore this is going to increasingly make them suspicious and increasingly limit how much they agree on. Now, the individuals who are going to deal with this agreement in 1943 are the Big 3. The Big 3, we should already know a lot of them. Stalin, we remember from our last course, and if you don't, something's gone seriously wrong. Next to him is the US President, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who has, although you can't see it there, he spends most of his time in a wheelchair and has polio. He will die of polio very soon. And finally on the right, you've got the old imperialist, the old reactionary, the old capitalist, the old hater of communism, Winston Churchill. As you can see, we're already quite a mixed group. So,
what you get is these people meeting. Now, relatively amicably at first, with the war still going on, they still very much need each other, so they decide that they're going to go to a country which is relatively accessible and relatively safe, considering Europe isn't, in November 1943, and they are off to Iran, and they meet in the capital city of Tehran. And President Roosevelt establishes a really pretty nice relationship between the Allies. And they agree that they're going to meet in Tehran, nearer to the USSR, This meeting is mainly a success for Stalin. Roosevelt and Churchill very much need the Russians. In 1943, France is still occupied. They don't have a foothold in Europe. So they are willing to acquiesce, that is, give in to some of the demands of Stalin. Roosevelt himself is relatively unwell, and increasingly so. And he tended to side with Stalin because he really felt he needed to sort of tame the Soviet leader. We know that Stalin is a difficult man to tame. So he tended to agree with Stalin over Churchill, and this angered Winston Churchill. Churchill had wanted to invade Germany through the Balkans. Those are the areas of Croatia and Bosnia today, rather than through France. Churchill thought that this was safe, and he wanted to do this to prevent the USSR from getting all of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt rejected the idea. Stalin says there is no way you're invading through the Balkans, those countries will be mine. And Roosevelt, willing to keep Stalin happy, overrules Churchill, and he sets that when they invade Europe, they will invade through France, not through the Balkans.
A fun fact about Tehran Conference, Mr. Jabril, our very own Mr. Jabril, her father-in-law lived in the house where Stalin was up in residence during the Tehran Conference. They moved the entire family out. Stalin and his entourage moved in, and actually he remembers being stroked on the head by Stalin himself, who found them quite adorable. Quite an interesting fact. So, what did they agree in the Tehran Conference? First things first. The UK and the USA would open up a second front. A front is the line between two armies where battles constantly happen. Again, and they're going to open up the second front by invading France in May 1944. Now, this is important to Stalin because obviously at this point in time, most German soldiers are in the east fighting Russians, killing Russians. And this, if they open up a second front, this means that America and Britain will have to contribute troops as well, and Germans will have to move over. It will make life easier for the Russians, and it will mean also that Russians are not the only people dying for this war. The USSR in turn agreed that they would fight Japan when Germany was defeated, although as we shall see that doesn't really happen. The United Nations, the UN, will be set up after the war to try and guarantee world peace, and there will be some areas of eastern Poland given to the USSR. So generally quite amicable. Generally people get on. They get on quite well.
Now, between the conferences, between Tehran and the next one at Yalta, the intensity between the superpowers increases. Now, the Russians are taking over more and more and more, and the Americans and the British are scrambling to get to Germany before the Russians take it all over themselves. They start to also become suspicious of each other's motives for their actions, especially after the war, amongst Churchill especially, but Roosevelt also starts to get the suspicion that Stalin isn't going to be an easy man to work with. This is a man who may not keep his agreements. This is a man who is bent on using the Second World War to take over as many countries as possible. So they start to become, at least in the United States and in Britain, very, very curious of Stalin. And Stalin doesn't necessarily trust them either. He believes that they will basically shaft him at every opportunity. So he's not necessarily willing to work with them, even though, again, they're, of course, allies.
I think key to this is this idea that at no point has their existing hatred ever been forgotten. It's just been hidden by the war and the common enemy of Germany.
So after Tehran, strains start to break in the Great Alliance. The Second Front idea becomes contentious. Stalin was annoyed that the United States and the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, delayed the landings at D-Day. We know June 6th, 1944, a day that will live in infamy, is when we attacked the beaches of Normandy and began to liberate France. Stalin wanted it to happen long before that and was angered. He believed that the delay in attacking the Normandy beaches was meant so that the Germans could destroy the Soviet Union, and he thought they did it intentionally. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, was ideologically opposed to Bolshevism, and he hated communist Russia. He was suspicious of Stalin. He was convinced that Soviet troops would take over the world. Poland was Britain's major concern. Britain thought that it should be free. Britain, of course, in 1939 went to war to defend Poland. When Britain declares war on Germany, it's because Germany invades Poland. Churchill did not want to turn Poland from a free country over to another occupier in the Soviet Union. He believed Stalin wanted Poland. And the Warsaw Uprising. The USSR did not help the Polish resistance, who were destroyed by Germany. There was a huge opportunity in late 1944 for the Germans to be crushed from the inside. The people of Poland, who had been subjugated for a period of 5 years, had had enough. And thousands rose up to fight the Germans. They caught the Germans completely off guard. They almost took over the capital city. Stalin did not intervene. The UK and the United States thought that Stalin could have seized this opportunity to help the Polish rebels, but Stalin let these rebels be crushed. And many of the Polish leaders, many of the army, many of the good stock of Polish society were murdered unscrupulously by the Nazis in retaliation. It was believed that Stalin left Poland defenseless. He let them suffer and die on purpose so that when he took over Poland, he would have no enemies within.
That's right. So, after Tehran, we see the next meeting is Yalta in February 1945. So, in 1945, it's pretty clear that the war is almost won. The Allies are closing in on Berlin from the west. They're about halfway by February. Let's work out. They're about to go through the Ardennes. They've just finished the Ardennes, so about Belgium way. And Russia is around Eastern Europe way, so they are crushing in. And more than that, the German war machine is crumbling. They are increasingly running out of supplies, increasingly turning out that they are running away, and they are also increasingly running out of soldiers, particularly soldiers of any merit and age. And we see children and old people fighting increasingly. They decide, therefore, to meet at Yalta and to decide what to do about Germany and particularly Europe after the war was over. Now, there is still a latent fear, a basic fear that they still need to work together in order to sort out Germany, particularly to sort out Germany quickly. So they still want to work together and agree. They know that if one of them hates the other one and doesn't really help them, they'll probably win the war, but it will cost many more lives than even really want to happen. As well as this, it's the same big three as before. And if you remember, actually, Roosevelt had done a good job of trying to make friends with Stalin, trying to agree to have some sort of compromise. This, however, will be the last meeting, as FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, will die shortly after the Yalta Conference. So, what was agreed at Yalta? Well, Germany will be split into 4 parts and occupied by each of the Allies. So Britain gets one zone, Russia gets a slightly bigger zone to the east, America gets one zone, and France, why not, gets another zone. Now, there's a problem. Berlin is in the east of Germany, which will belong to Russia, and obviously the Allies don't really want that to happen. So what they'll do as well is split Berlin into 4 different pieces. So you've got this weird part where, if you imagine a map of Germany, it is all of Eastern Germany is owned by Russia, or is at least occupied by Russia in a temporary solution. Okay, and then Berlin is also sort of controlled in 4 different ways as well. USSR again would have joined the war against Japan when Germany was defeated. The Nazis, the leading Nazis, will be hunted down and put on trial in the international courts for revenge. The liberated countries, though, would be allowed to hold free elections. This will be a cause of contention in due course when, actually, surprise, surprise, Stalin's elections tend to be less free than he promised. They all promised to join the UN, and that generally happens. But more than that, the Allies recognise that Eastern Europe will be what is called a sphere of influence. A sphere of influence means that one country has, by right almost, are allowed to control or at least influence what goes on in that area. This was an attempt to try and make Stalin agree to all of this and make Stalin be reassured. This is not the Allies saying you can have and own all of Eastern Europe. It's that saying you can be the big dog in Eastern Europe and have more of a say.
So there are some pretty key disagreements at Yalta. Number 1, they disagreed on how much money Germany would have to pay for war damage. You may be familiar with the term reparations. Germany was forced to pay reparations after World War I as one of the major reasons Hitler came to power. He said that I don't want to pay these fees anymore. The Soviet Union wanted Germany to pay more. The decision on this was delayed until the next conference. Poland Of course, Stalin wanted a Polish-German border to be further west. He wanted a friendly Polish government. So in other words, he basically wanted all of Poland, and he wanted Poland to basically listen to him. The Western leaders felt that what he really meant was that he wanted the Soviets to control the government of Poland, and therefore to control Poland. They persuade Stalin to allow free elections in Poland, but this is something that Stalin's not necessarily still keen on, but he's willing to at least agree to it at Yalta. So there were a few things start to change. Of course, this is February 1945. World War II in Europe ends in May 1945, and World War II ends overall by defeat of Japan in August of 1945. And in the 5 months between Yalta and Potsdam, which takes place later in 1945, there a number of major changes take place. Number one, the Soviet troops liberate Eastern Europe. They completely remove Germany from Eastern Europe. They take over countries like Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Also, Stalin sets up communist governments in Poland. He ignores the wishes of the Poles and ignores his agreement made at Yalta to allow free elections. He insists that this was a defensive measure to prevent future attack. The Red Army also expands. So Stalin increases the size of his military force. It becomes the largest army in the world, and he refuses to demilitarize even though he's beaten Nazi Germany. He says that, I still need my army. This is a direct provocation, a direct threat. Who is he going to use this giant army against? Perhaps the United States, perhaps Great Britain.
As well as this, in the US, FDR has died of complications of his polio, and he's been replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman is what we would describe as a Cold War warrior. Unlike Franklin Roosevelt, he fears communism. And more than that, he fears that Stalin has bad intentions towards the East. He fears that Stalin is intending to take as much of the East as he possibly can. And he will just constantly take advantage of the American goodwill and the American trust. And much like you would deal with anyone who's taking advantage of your trust, the way you deal with it is you end up standing up to them to some extent. And he argued that if I take a more firm stand, if America takes a firmer stand on Russia, they won't take advantage as much. As well as this, the USA successfully has tested in secret its atomic bomb. However, interestingly, first, a spy within the bomb program had already told Stalin about this, and Stalin obviously wasn't a little bit upset that he wasn't told in advance that there was this new wonder weapon. But as well as this, Truman does the right thing at the start of Potsdam and informs Stalin. Stalin obviously was furious, but he was furious from well before this to some extent because he already knew. So, on top of this, and finally, the old imperialist Churchill loses the election in 1945 to Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee is the Labour leader. Labour leader, you might expect he to be sympathetic to the left-wing Stalin, but British Labour Party at this point is, although in theory socialist, nowhere near Stalin, and far closer ideologically to USA than Stalin. The interesting thing about Attlee is actually he's far more accepting of British weakness and therefore far more likely to go along with whatever Harry Truman says. This means that the two camps are divided. It could have been that we had a moderator and Attlee was the middle ground. However, that doesn't happen in the end.
So that leaves us at Potsdam. This conference takes place in July 1945. At this point, Germany has been defeated, but Japan had not quite been defeated yet. And in Potsdam, they agree to do a number of things. Again, they reiterate their wish to divide Germany and Berlin into 4 sectors. In each one of those would be occupied and administered by one of the Allies. Number 2, they said that Germany shouldn't have an army. It would demilitarize Germany to prevent it from fighting again. They also agreed that they would reestablish democracy in Germany. Germany would have free elections, a free press, and it would go on to become much like it was before Hitler took over. Number 4, Germany would have to pay reparations to the Allies in terms of equipment and material, and most of these reparations, this money and material, would go to the Soviet Union, as it suffered the most. Number 5, they would ban the Nazi Party. They would make it illegal to become a Nazi, and leading Nazis would be put in trial at Nuremberg, a city in Germany, in 1946, and made to pay for their crimes committed during World War II, most notably the Holocaust. And number 6, they would participate fully in a United Nations that would hopefully keep world peace. And number 7, Poland's frontier would be moved a little bit westwards in accordance with Stalin's wishes to the river Oder and Neisse.
Although this looks like a lot, have a look at the list. Most of this is stuff they've already agreed, and it's not a big deal to agree on what you've already agreed. There's big things missing, and actually all the stuff they have, new stuff they've agreed, are really quite minor. Ban the Nazi Party. Well, who's going to be pro-Nazi Party? There's not a massively... most of the big issues, particularly what's going to happen in Eastern Europe, have not been addressed because they just simply couldn't. So, there was these big disagreements, particularly revolve around what to do with Germany. USSR wants to have, I think, almost like France in the Treaty of Versailles, wants to have huge compensation, cripple Germany, even break it up at one point, they suggest. Truman refused, in part because he doesn't want to happen again what happened at Versailles, but a little bit more as well. That's Truman realizes that Germany will be on the front line of any fight between Russia and the USSR, and therefore they want to make sure it's as strong as possible, and particularly as friendly to the capitalists as possible. So Stalin, Truman says, look, we keep Germany. Stalin wants to destroy Germany to protect it, and there's no agreement about what to do with it. As well as this, while there's promise of free elections in Germany, Stalin refuses to allow free elections in Eastern Europe and refuses to promise them as a matter of course. He will do a couple of elections, but as we shall see, they will be heavily rigged. Stalin thought that the US was becoming interfering, that the Eastern Europe had been captured by Soviet soldiers, captured with Soviet blood, and therefore the US shouldn't tell him what to do. Truman is furious, and then saw this as further evidence that Stalin is willing to take over Eastern Europe and wasn't interested in the goodness of just getting rid of Germany, and therefore sees this as further evidence that he needs to be tough against the USSR.
So that leads us sort of to the end. So World War II comes to a final close after the atomic bomb falls on Japan in the 11th and the second one on the 13th of August 1945. Within a day, Japan surrenders, and you have the end of the Second World War. The question then becomes, what happens next? What we see almost immediately is what becomes the onset of the Cold War. The question is, who is more responsible? Was it Russia? Or was it the United States? So let's analyze each country specifically. I'll take Russia, and Mr. Suter will take the United States. The first and foremost, let's look at the reasons the USSR might have been responsible for starting the Cold War. Number one, they're the most aggressive nation by far. They occupy Eastern Europe. They advance their military while others are demilitarized. Don't forget that the Russians refuse to make their army smaller after the war is over. In fact, they increase it. This is really a factor of Stalin's stubbornness. Before Truman, Stalin was the aggressor. And before Truman came along, drove a hard line on Stalin, Stalin was really the one who wouldn't cooperate and wouldn't work. Of course, the Russians under Stalin set up communist governments in Eastern Europe. They create a Red Scare, a fact that the Soviets are going to take over everywhere, and a major reason to be concerned for the United Kingdom and, of course, most nominally the United States. They also didn't trust the United States. They didn't like its A-bomb development, and were refusing to really accept Truman's admission that he would tell them about the A-bomb. So Stalin sort of loses it over this. And again, of course, they will renege on many of the agreements that they make in Yalta and Tehran and at Potsdam. Poland is occupied. There are no free elections in Eastern Europe. So why did they do that? Now, of course, they do things, but sometimes there are legitimate reasons for them, and it's up to you to judge how legitimate these are. But here are the reasons that Russia acted the way they did. Russia had been invaded twice by Nazi Germany in 25 years, and they wanted it punished very severely, so as to prevent it from happening again. And they weren't necessarily willing to give up their hold on Germany, to turn it over to be a free and democratic country. Number two, of course, is the goal ultimately of Stalin of Soviet expansion. He wanted to create a buffer zone, a number of countries that would separate Germany and the West, and the Soviet Union, so that if they were to be attacked, they would have to go through a number of friendly countries to the Soviet Union, so the Soviet Union could never be destroyed or be threatened like that again. And third, Stalin was upset by Truman's announcement that the United States had built an A-bomb, and that the USA would have the upper hand in any future arms race, so he was willing to be aggressive to show his anger.
Fantastic. So, on the other hand, what about the USA? So, number one, they didn't really tell the USSR about the A-bomb, which created tension and anger and suspicion. Stalin looks at this and says, well, we're allies, and if you're not telling us about this, the only reason is that you are going to plan to use it on us in due course. Obviously, it goes without saying the USA refused to share any of the information about the A-bomb as well, which sends further negative message. The USA was also unsympathetic to the USSR's opinion and didn't really understand the impact of losing such a huge amount of civilians and soldiers. We're talking between 20 and 30 million by most estimates, a good chunk of the overall deaths in World War II, both including soldiers and civilians, and therefore didn't really understand the Russian willingness to get revenge, and also the feeling that they needed to get something tangible from all this devastation and death. As well as this, and I think a real damaging sort of blow comes from the fact that Truman mishandles, or at least takes a hard-line anti-communist stance, which makes compromise very, very difficult, and sours, let's be honest, the already quite easy to upset Stalin. Okay, Truman is obsessed with this idea of spheres of influence, and actually seems to be almost willing to divide the world in half, so that in a quest to make sure that Stalin won't take any more. As well, there is a latent distrust of the USSR. There's a basic distrust amongst the US, particularly Truman, which means they refuse to really agree on most compromises because they don't believe they'll hold them up. Admittedly, the Russians had kept their soldiers in Eastern Europe even after they were needed there, which is quite a big hint about what's to come. I'm going to talk about that in due course because it's a really nice point to show off to an examiner. Why do they do this? They are genuinely concerned about Stalin's motives in Eastern Europe, and actually, as we see what happens, they probably had rights to be to some extent. They were particularly surprised and also told by these intentions by their refusal to allow free elections in Poland. As well as this, the USA didn't want, its big opinion on Germany wasn't just because it wanted an ally in the future, it also didn't want to punish Germany like what happened in World War I, because as we all know, that didn't really turn out amazingly well.
So, who's to blame? Realistically, we're looking at blame shared on both sides. Effectively, what really made this all happen was a lack of mutual trust between the United States and the USSR. They just did not trust each other, and that fundamentally has its sort of basis in the fact that they have two different economic systems and two different sets of beliefs, and these sets of belief make any ability to trust each other almost impossible, and as such they made things worse and worse and worse by taking an aggressive stance, most particularly at Potsdam, and you're left with a situation where by the end of 1945 you are locked in a Cold War, and Europe is clearly divided, as we can see in the map on the next page.
Absolutely right. And this is the beginning of the end. Interestingly, if you look at the countries on the right of the line, they will very quickly be part of the Eastern Bloc, or the Eastern Sphere of Influence, where Russia controls. Very, very interesting and very important to realize that most of these areas on the right side, which end up being controlled by Russia, are areas where Russian soldiers have entered due to their fighting Germany back. It is not an accident that in Italy, where there's not many Russian soldiers at all, if any, okay, that the Allies win, that the Americans and the British, they keep them in capitalists. When you have soldiers in a country, it's very easy to rig elections and very easy to get rid of unhelpful opponents, and this is what's going to happen, as we shall see.
So the process of making Eastern European more Russian and increasing the tensions of the Cold War, and how all of those little countries have slipped into the Soviet fold, is what we look at next lesson. A little bit of a long one. Hope you enjoyed.
Enjoy.